The bitter January cold seeped through the cracks of the security checkpoint as Morgan Reynolds clutched her steaming coffee, watching scientists and engineers stream past with barely a glance in her direction. 5 years at Oakridge National Laboratory, and she was still just a face behind a badge scanner to most of them. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Morgan's security monitor displayed a steady stream of clearance authorizations, each one representing another brilliant mind heading to work on projects she would never fully understand. She had once dreamed of being one of them. Her nuclear physics degree from MIT should have put her on that path, but the disastrous incident during her internship at Los Alamos had changed everything. Now she was just another security officer, albeit one massively overqualified for her position. "Reynolds," the sharp voice cut through the ambient hum of the security station. "My office. Now." Director Victor Hargrove didn't wait for a response before stalking away, his expensive shoes clicking against the polished floor. Morgan's stomach tightened as she nodded to her colleague to cover the checkpoint and followed Hargrove toward the administrative wing. The director's corner office overlooked the sprawling laboratory complex, the gleaming research buildings surrounded by layers of security fencing that Morgan knew intimately. Hargrove's walls were adorned with framed certificates, awards, and photographs with government officials. The desk was immaculate except for a single folder lying open before him. "Sit," he commanded without looking up. Morgan perched on the edge of the chair, back straight, waiting. After several uncomfortable moments, Hargrove finally raised his eyes to meet hers. "Do you know why I've called you in here?" His voice carried the clipped precision of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "No, sir," Morgan replied, keeping her voice neutral. She had learned long ago that showing emotion around Hargrove only gave him more ammunition. He pushed the folder toward her. Inside was her latest security protocol recommendation, a detailed analysis of potential vulnerabilities in the laboratory's radiological material tracking system. She had spent weeks compiling it, working late into the night, applying her physics background to identify weaknesses that others might have missed. "This," Hargrove said, tapping the document with one manicured finger, "is not your job." Morgan fought to keep her expression blank. "Security protocol reviews are within my purview as Deputy Chief of Security Operations." Hargrove's thin smile never reached his eyes. "Your job is to make sure badges scan properly and to follow established procedures. Not to waste valuable time on." He glanced down at the report with disdain. "Theoretical vulnerabilities in systems that have worked perfectly fine for years." The dismissal stung, but Morgan had grown accustomed to Hargrove's particular brand of condescension over the past 3 years since he'd taken over as security director. He had never forgiven her for having credentials that surpassed his own, despite her lower position. "The isotope tracking system has gaps that could be exploited," Morgan said evenly, "especially with the new quantum computing facility coming online next month." "The authentication protocols are none of your concern," Hargrove interrupted. "Dr. Whitmore and his team have assured me that all systems are secure and compliant with federal regulations." Morgan bit back her first response. Dr. Whitmore was brilliant in theoretical physics, but notoriously dismissive of security concerns. His team had consistently prioritized research access over proper security protocols. "With respect, sir, I identified 3 specific vulnerabilities that could allow unauthorized access to Category 1 nuclear materials inventory data. Given that we're housing increased quantities of weapons-grade uranium for the new research initiative." "That's enough," Hargrove snapped, closing the folder. "Your job is to follow protocols, not to invent problems where none exist. This is exactly the kind of alarmist overthinking that got you removed from the Los Alamos program." The reference to her past hit like a physical blow. The Los Alamos incident had been a misunderstanding. Her raising concerns about potential radiation exposure had been labeled as creating panic when she'd been proven right weeks later. But by then, the damage to her career had been done. "My concerns at Los Alamos were validated by subsequent investigations," Morgan said quietly, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Hargrove leaned back in his chair, a thin smile playing on his lips. "And yet, here you are, scanning badges instead of conducting research. Perhaps there's a lesson in that about knowing your place." He slid the folder into his desk drawer. I won't be submitting this report. The systems review for the Department of Energy inspection next month has already been completed by qualified personnel. Morgan felt her cheeks burn. Those qualified personnel don't have my background in nuclear materials security. What they have is the ability to work within established parameters instead of constantly questioning authority. Hargrove's phone rang, saving Morgan from whatever cutting remark was to follow. He answered with smooth efficiency, immediately shifting into a deferential tone that he never used with his subordinates. Morgan sat silently, her mind racing. She knew her security assessment was sound. The new quantum computing research required enhanced safeguards that the current system simply wasn't designed to handle. It wasn't just about compliance. It was about preventing potentially catastrophic security breaches. "That will be all, Reynolds," Hargrove said after hanging up, already turning his attention to his computer screen. "And I'd suggest focusing on your actual duties rather than playing nuclear scientist. Your quarterly performance review is coming up, and I'd hate to see you lose the little credibility you have left in this facility." The dismissal was clear. Morgan stood, her face carefully composed to hide the frustration boiling inside her. "Yes, sir." As she walked back to her security station, Morgan passed the entrance to the new quantum computing research wing, where Dr. Whitmore's team was preparing for next month's official launch. Through the glass walls, she could see scientists moving purposefully around equipment worth millions of dollars. Equipment that would soon be connected to systems that could access sensitive nuclear materials data. Her security clearance gave her access to most areas of the facility, but her actual authority had been systematically undermined by Hargrove since his arrival. Any concerns she raised were dismissed as overreactions, her background in nuclear physics treated as irrelevant to her current role. Back at her station, Morgan relieved her colleague and resumed monitoring the steady stream of personnel entering the facility. Each face that passed through her checkpoint represented another brilliant mind engaged in cutting-edge research, while her own expertise gathered dust. "Rough meeting with the Dragon?" asked Carlos Jimenez, her fellow security officer who was reviewing camera feeds at the adjacent console. "The usual," Morgan replied, not wanting to elaborate further. Carlos was a good guy, but he didn't have the clearance level to discuss most of what concerned her about the facility's security measures. "He's been worse than usual lately," Carlos observed, keeping his voice low. "Word is the new DOE inspection has him on edge." Apparently there were some questions raised after the last quarterly review. Morgan's interest was immediately piqued. "What kind of questions?" Carlos shrugged. "Above my pay grade. But Jensen in materials tracking mentioned something about inventory discrepancies. Nothing major, just administrative errors, but enough to trigger enhanced scrutiny next month." Inventory discrepancies. In a facility housing Category 1 nuclear materials, even minor administrative errors warranted serious investigation. If materials tracking records showed inconsistencies, it could indicate anything from sloppy bookkeeping to something far more sinister. "Thanks for the heads up," Morgan said, her mind already working through the implications. "I might need to adjust some of the checkpoint verification protocols." Carlos gave her a knowing look. "Just don't let Hargrove catch you exceeding your station again." Morgan managed to smile, but her thoughts were already elsewhere. If there were inventory discrepancies, she needed to know more, especially with the new quantum computing facility about to go online. The combination of cutting-edge computing power and nuclear materials tracking created vulnerabilities that someone with the right knowledge could exploit. As the day wore on, Morgan maintained her professional demeanor while internally formulating a plan. Her position might be just a security officer in Hargrove's eyes, but her access badge still opened most doors in the facility. After her shift ended, she would take a detour through the materials tracking department and see what she could learn about these, quote, administrators. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. At precisely 6:45 p.m., Morgan clocked out from her shift and headed toward the administrative wing instead of the exit. Most of the day, staff had already left, but she knew Jensen from materials tracking often worked late on Thursdays to reconcile the weekly inventory reports. The materials tracking office was quiet when she arrived. just as she'd hoped. Only Jensen's desk light illuminated the otherwise darkened space. "Morgan?" Jensen looked up in surprise. "Need something? I thought your shift ended at 6. "Just finished," Morgan said casually, leaning against the doorframe. "Carlos mentioned you've been dealing with some inventory discrepancies. Thought I should know if there's anything that might affect security protocols." Jensen glanced around nervously before gesturing her inside. "Close the door." Morgan complied, her concern growing at Jensen's obvious discomfort. Jensen was normally unflappable, a 20-year veteran of nuclear materials management who approached his job with meticulous precision. "I've been finding small inconsistencies in the U-235 inventory records," he said in a low voice once Morgan had taken a seat. "Nothing major, fractions of a gram here and there, but it's been happening consistently for the past 4 months. Morgan felt a chill run down her spine. Weapons-grade uranium was tracked down to the milligram. Even tiny discrepancies were serious business. "Could it be measurement error?" she asked, though she already knew better. "The lab's equipment was calibrated to perfection," Jensen shook his head. "That was my first thought. Had the scales recalibrated twice, same issues. Then I thought it might be record-keeping errors, but—" He hesitated. "But what?" "The pattern is too consistent. Always the same small amount. Always from different storage locations. Always on days when certain personnel are accessing the materials." "Have you reported this up the chain?" Morgan asked, though she suspected the answer. "To Hargrove, yes. He said it was within acceptable variance margins and not to create unnecessary paperwork before the DOE inspection." Jensen's expression made it clear what he thought of that response. "But it's not within acceptable margins, not for Category O materials. Not even close." Morgan felt a growing sense of unease. "Can I see the data?" Jensen hesitated. "It's all in the system. I don't have hard copies. And you don't have access to the materials tracking database." "I have nuclear materials security clearance," Morgan reminded him. "Yes, but Hargrove restricted database access last month. Said it was to streamline information security before the quantum computing integration." Jensen's finger traced nervous patterns on his desk. "Morgan, something doesn't feel right, but I can't prove anything without more access. And Hargrove's watching me like a hawk since I raised concerns." Morgan made a quick decision. "What if I could help you analyze the data without accessing the database directly? If you run some specific queries for me?" Jensen looked conflicted, but finally nodded. "What do you need to know?" "First, I need to know which storage locations have shown discrepancies and on which exact dates. Then, I need to cross-reference those with personnel access logs for those specific locations and times." As Jensen began typing, pulling up the data Morgan requested, she felt her pulse quicken. This was no longer theoretical. If someone was systematically removing small amounts of weapons-grade uranium from the facility, the implications were terrifying. For the next hour, Morgan and Jensen meticulously documented the pattern of discrepancies. It was subtle but undeniable once they laid it all out. Tiny amounts of material, consistently missing after specific research sessions, always when particular combinations of personnel were present. "There's one more thing," Jensen said as they finished. "The quantum computing integration team has been requesting unusual access to the materials database structure. Not just the data, but the actual architecture of the system." Morgan frowned. "That makes no sense. They should only need to connect to the API endpoints, not access the underlying database structure." "That's what I thought." But Hargrove approved it personally. Jensen rubbed his eyes tiredly. Said it was necessary for proper system integration. As Morgan walked to her car that evening, her mind was racing, small quantities of weapons-grade uranium disappearing. Unusual database access requests. Hargrove dismissing legitimate security concerns. The quantum computing facility coming online in weeks. It all pointed to something deeply troubling. She needed more information, but how to get it without alerting Hargrove? As she unlocked her car, a plan began to form. Dr. Eliza Chen in the nuclear forensics department was an old friend from MIT, one of the few people at the lab who still treated Morgan as a scientist rather than just security personnel. If anyone could help her understand what someone might do with small amounts of stolen uranium, it would be Eliza. The next morning, Morgan arrived at the facility early, timing her entry to coincide with the shift change when the security checkpoints were busiest. She nodded to the night shift officer she was relieving. "Anything I should know about?" she asked, the standard shift change question. All quiet, though Dr. Chen from nuclear forensics was here until nearly midnight. Something about urgent sample analysis. The officer yawned as he gathered his things. Have fun with the morning rush. Morgan's interest was immediately piqued. Eliza working late on urgent analysis? That wasn't typical unless something significant had happened. As the morning shift began and scientists streamed through her checkpoint, Morgan kept an eye out for Eliza. She appeared around 8:30, looking tired but focused. "Dr. Chen," Morgan called as Eliza swiped her badge. Security protocol update requires verbal confirmation of destination for all nuclear forensics personnel today. It was a lie, but a harmless one that would give her a moment to speak with Eliza without arousing suspicion. Eliza raised an eyebrow but played along. Nuclear Forensics Lab, Section C. "Thank you, Doctor. And I may need to follow up with you later about the new protocols." "When would be convenient?" Understanding flickered in Eliza's eyes. They'd known each other long enough to recognize when something was off. "My lunch break, 1 p.m. I usually eat in the courtyard by Building 7. Morgan nodded professionally. "Thank you for your cooperation." The morning dragged by as Morgan maintained her post, checking badges and monitoring security feeds while her mind worked through the puzzle pieces she'd gathered. By the time her lunch break arrived, she had formulated specific questions that needed answers. The courtyard by Building 7 was a small green space with benches and tables where researchers often ate when the weather permitted. Despite the January chill, Eliza was there, bundled in a thick coat and scarf, a thermos of what was likely hot soup on the table before her. "This feels clandestine," Eliza remarked as Morgan sat down across from her. "What's going on, Morgan?" Morgan glanced around to ensure they weren't being overheard. "I need your expertise, not as a friend, but as a nuclear forensics specialist. Hypothetically, what could someone do with small amounts of weapons-grade uranium removed from a facility like this over time?" Eliza's expression grew serious. "That's not a hypothetical I'm comfortable discussing without context. I've discovered what appear to be systematic discrepancies in the U-235 inventory," Morgan said quietly. "Small amounts, but consistent over months. Hargrove is dismissing it as measurement error." Eliza's face paled slightly. "How small are we talking?" "Fractions of a gram per incident, but adding up to approximately 30 grams over 4 months. "Jesus," Eliza whispered. "That's not measurement error. That's deliberate theft." "What could someone do with that amount?" Morgan pressed. Eliza took a sip from her thermos, clearly buying time to think. "Not a full-scale weapon, but 30 grams of weapons-grade material could be used for a radiological dispersal device, a dirty bomb. Or it could be a sample for analysis, perhaps to help someone develop enrichment techniques." She paused. "Morgan, if what you're saying is true, this is a matter for the FBI and Department of Energy Security." "I know, but I need more evidence before making that kind of accusation. Hargrove would bury me." "What do you need from me?" "Last night, you were here late doing urgent analysis." "What was it?" Eliza hesitated. "I'm not supposed to discuss it, but we received a sample from outside the facility. Trace particles collected by environmental monitoring stations about 2 miles from here. They showed isotopic signatures consistent with our enriched materials." Morgan felt her blood run cold. Someone's taking material off-site. "It looks that way. We're still which is not protocol. We should be escalating this to DOE headquarters immediately." Morgan's mind raced. If uranium was being detected outside the facility, the situation was even more serious than she'd feared. And Hargrove's response, ordering a halt to the investigation rather than escalating it, was deeply suspicious. "The quantum computing facility integration," Morgan said slowly. "Could it be related?" "They've been requesting unusual access to the materials tracking database structure." Eliza frowned. "I don't see how unless—" She paused, her eyes widening slightly. "Unless they're planning to use the quantum computing capabilities to manipulate the tracking system itself. With quantum computing power, they could potentially create a back door that would be nearly impossible to detect with conventional security measures. Creating a perfect cover for ongoing theft," Morgan finished the thought. The system would show everything balanced when it wasn't. That's theoretically possible, yes. Eliza looked troubled. Morgan, this is beyond serious. If someone is stealing enriched uranium and planning to use quantum computing to cover their tracks, we could be looking at a sophisticated attempt at nuclear terrorism or proliferation. Morgan nodded grimly. I need to get into the quantum computing facility, see what they're actually working on. That's incredibly risky. Your clearance might get you in the door, but if Hargrove finds out… I know, but what choice do I have? If I'm right about this, lives are at stake. Eliza studied her for a long moment. There's a system test scheduled tonight at 9 p.m. Most of the regular staff will be gone, but the integration team will be there. I'm supposed to provide radiation monitoring support, which means I can bring an assistant without raising eyebrows. Can you get me in? I can try. Meet me at the rear entrance to Building 3 at 8:45. Wear a lab coat and bring your badge. Eliza gathered her things. And Morgan, be careful. If you're right about this, whoever is behind it won't hesitate to eliminate threats. As Eliza walked away, Morgan sat alone in the cold courtyard, the full weight of what she was considering settling on her shoulders. She was no longer just a security officer concerned about protocols. She was potentially stepping into the middle of a nuclear terrorism plot with only her wits and her largely dismissed expertise to guide her. For years, Hargrove and others had treated her as just security, a failed scientist relegated to checking badges. But if her suspicions were correct, her unique combination of nuclear physics knowledge and security expertise might be exactly what was needed to prevent a catastrophe. Morgan checked her watch. She had 6 hours until she would meet Eliza. 6 hours to prepare for what might be the most important night of her life. As she stood to return to her post, her phone buzzed with a message. It was from an unknown number, but the content made her blood freeze. Stop digging into materials tracking discrepancies. Some questions are dangerous to ask. Final warning. Someone knew what she was doing, and they were watching. At precisely 6:45 p.m., Morgan clocked out from her shift and headed toward the administrative wing instead of the exit. Most of the day's staff had already left, but she knew Jensen from Materials Tracking often worked late on Thursdays to reconcile the weekly inventory reports. The Materials Tracking office was quiet when she arrived, just as she'd hoped. Only Jensen's desk light illuminated the otherwise darkened space. Morgan? Jensen looked up in surprise. Need something? I thought your shift ended at 6. Just finished, Morgan said casually, leaning against the doorframe. Carlos mentioned you've been dealing with some inventory discrepancies. Thought I should know if there's anything that might affect security protocols. Jensen glanced around nervously before gesturing her inside. Close the door. Morgan complied, her concern growing at Jensen's obvious discomfort. Jensen was normally unflappable, a 20-year veteran of nuclear materials management who approached his job with meticulous precision. I've been finding small inconsistencies in the U-235 inventory records, he said in a low voice once Morgan had taken a seat. Nothing major. Fractions of a gram here and there, but it's been happening consistently for the past 4 months. That was my first thought. Had the scales recalibrated twice. Same issues. Then I thought it might be record-keeping errors, but… He hesitated. But what? The pattern is too consistent. Always the same small amount. Always from different storage locations. Always on days when certain personnel are accessing the materials. Have you reported this up the chain? Morgan asked, though she suspected the answer. To Hargrove, yes. He said it was within acceptable variance margins and not to create unnecessary paperwork before the DOE inspection. Jensen's expression made it clear what he thought of that response. But it's not within acceptable margins, not for Category 1 materials. Not even close. Morgan felt a growing sense of unease. Can I see the data? Jensen hesitated. It's all in the system. I don't have hard copies. And you don't have access to the materials tracking database. I have nuclear materials security clearance, Morgan reminded him. Yes, but Hargrove restricted database access last month. Said it was to streamline information security, before the quantum computing integration. Jensen's finger traced nervous patterns on his desk. Morgan, something doesn't feel right. But I can't prove anything without more access. And Hargrove's watching me like a hawk since I raised concerns. Morgan made a quick decision. What if I could help you analyze the data without accessing the database directly? If you run some specific queries for me. Jensen looked conflicted but finally nodded. What do you need to know? First, I need to know which storage locations have shown discrepancies and on which exact dates. Then, I need to cross-reference those with personnel access logs for those specific locations and times. As Jensen began typing, pulling up the data Morgan requested, she felt her pulse quicken. This was no longer theoretical. If someone was systematically removing small amounts of weapons-grade uranium from the facility, the implications were terrifying. For the next hour, Morgan and Jensen meticulously documented the pattern of discrepancies. It was subtle, but undeniable once they laid it all out. Tiny amounts of material, consistently missing after specific research sessions, always when particular combinations of personnel were present. There's one more thing, Jensen said as they finished. The quantum computing integration team has been requesting unusual access to the materials database structure. Not just the data, but the actual architecture of the system. Morgan frowned. That makes no sense. They should only need to connect to the API endpoints, not access the underlying database structure. That's what I thought. But Hargrove approved it personally. Jensen rubbed his eyes tiredly, said it was necessary for proper system integration. As Morgan walked to her car that evening, her mind was racing. Small quantities of weapons-grade uranium disappearing. Unusual database access requests. Hargrove dismissing legitimate security concerns. The quantum computing facility coming online in weeks. It all pointed to something deeply troubling. She needed more information, but how to get it without alerting Hargrove? As she unlocked her car, a plan began to form. Dr. Eliza Chen in the Nuclear Forensics Department was an old friend from MIT, one of the few people at the lab who still treated Morgan as a scientist rather than just security personnel. If anyone could help her understand what someone might do with small amounts of stolen uranium, it would be Eliza. The next morning, Morgan arrived at the facility early, timing her entry to coincide with the shift change when the security checkpoints were busiest. She nodded to the night shift officer she was relieving. "Anything I should know about?" she asked, the standard shift change question. All quiet, though Dr. Chen from Nuclear Forensics was here until nearly midnight. Something about urgent sample analysis. The officer yawned as he gathered his things. Have fun with the morning rush. Morgan's interest was immediately piqued. Eliza working late on urgent analysis? That wasn't typical, unless something significant had happened. As the morning shift began and scientists streamed through her checkpoint, Morgan kept an eye out for Eliza. She appeared around 8:30, looking tired but focused. Dr. Chen, Morgan called as Eliza swiped her badge. Security protocol update requires verbal confirmation of destination for... It was a lie, but a harmless one that would give her a moment to speak with Eliza without arousing suspicion. Eliza raised an eyebrow but played along. Nuclear Forensics Lab, Section C. Thank you, Doctor, and I may need to follow up with you later about the new protocols. When would be convenient? Understanding flickered in Eliza's eyes. They'd known each other long enough to recognize when something was off. My lunch break, 1 p.m. I usually eat in the courtyard by Building 7. Morgan nodded professionally. Thank you for your cooperation. The morning dragged by as Morgan maintained her post, checking badges and monitoring security feeds while her mind worked through the puzzle pieces she'd gathered. By the time her lunch break arrived, she had formulated specific questions that needed answers. The courtyard by Building 7 was a small green space with benches and tables where researchers often ate when the weather permitted. Despite the January chill, Eliza was there, bundled in a thick coat and scarf, a thermos of what was likely hot soup on the table before her. This feels clandestine, Eliza remarked as Morgan sat down across from her. What's going on, Morgan? Morgan glanced around to ensure they weren't being overheard. I need your expertise. Not as a friend, but as a nuclear forensics specialist. Hypothetically, what could someone do with small amounts of weapons-grade uranium removed from a facility like this over time? Eliza's expression grew serious. That's not a hypothetical I'm comfortable discussing without context. I've discovered what appear to be systematic discrepancies in the U-235 inventory, Morgan said quietly. Small amounts, but consistent over months. Hargrove is dismissing it as measurement error. Eliza's face paled slightly. How small are we talking? Fractions of a gram per incident. But adding up to approximately 30 grams over 4 months. Jesus, Eliza whispered. That's not measurement error. That's deliberate theft. What could someone do with that amount? Morgan pressed. Eliza took a sip from her thermos, clearly buying time to think. Not a full-scale weapon, but 30 grams of weapons-grade material could be used for a radiological dispersal device. A dirty bomb. Or it could be a sample for analysis, perhaps to help someone develop enrichment techniques. She paused. Morgan, if what you're saying is true, this is a matter for the FBI and Department of Energy Security. I know, but I need more evidence before making that kind of accusation. Hargrove would bury me. What do you need from me? Last night you were here late doing urgent analysis. What was it? Eliza hesitated. I'm not supposed to discuss it, but we received a sample from outside the facility. Trace particles collected by environmental monitoring stations about 2 miles from here. They showed isotopic signatures consistent with our enriched materials. Morgan felt her blood run cold. Someone's taking material off-site. It looks that way. We're still confirming, but the preliminary analysis is concerning. I reported it to Hargrove this morning. And? He said he'd handle it, and ordered me to suspend further analysis pending his review. Eliza's expression darkened. Which is not protocol. We should be escalating this to DOE headquarters immediately. Morgan's mind raced. If uranium was being detected outside the facility, the situation was even more serious than she'd feared. And Hargrove's response, ordering a halt to the investigation rather than escalating it, was deeply suspicious. The quantum computing facility integration, Morgan said slowly. Could it be related? They've been requesting unusual access to the materials tracking database structure. Eliza frowned. I don't see how, unless… She paused, her eyes widening slightly. Unless they're planning to use the quantum computing capabilities to manipulate the tracking system itself, with quantum computing power, they could potentially create a backdoor that would be nearly impossible to detect with conventional security measures. Creating a perfect cover for ongoing theft, Morgan finished the thought. The system would show everything balanced when it wasn't. That's theoretically possible, yes. Eliza looked troubled. Eliza studied her for a long moment. There's a system test scheduled tonight at 9 p.m. Most of the regular staff will be gone, but the integration team will be there. I'm supposed to provide radiation monitoring support, which means I can bring an assistant without raising eyebrows. Can you get me in? I can try. Meet me at the rear entrance to Building 3 at 8:45. Wear a lab coat and bring your badge. Eliza gathered her things. And Morgan, be careful. If you're right about this, whoever is behind it won't hesitate to eliminate threats. As Eliza walked away, Morgan sat alone in the cold courtyard, the full weight of what she was considering settling on her shoulders. She was no longer just a security officer concerned about protocols. She was potentially stepping into the middle of a nuclear terrorism plot, with only her wits and her largely dismissed expertise to guide her. For years, Hargrove and others had treated her as just security, a failed scientist relegated to checking badges. But if her suspicions were correct, her unique combination of nuclear physics knowledge and security expertise might be exactly what was needed to prevent a catastrophe. Morgan checked her watch. She had 6 hours until she would meet Eliza. 6 hours to prepare for what might be the most important night of her life. As she stood to return to her post, her phone buzzed with a message. It was from an unknown number, but the content made her blood freeze. Stop digging into materials tracking discrepancies. Some questions are dangerous to ask. Final warning. Someone knew what she was doing. And they were watching. Morgan stared at her phone for several long seconds, her mind racing. The message confirmed her suspicions. There was something seriously wrong at the lab. But it also meant she was in danger. She quickly took a screenshot of the message before deleting it from her phone. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Back at her security station, Morgan maintained her professional demeanor while subtly adjusting the security cameras in her sector. If someone was watching her, she wanted to see who might be paying unusual attention to her movements. She also needed to prepare for tonight's covert investigation. "Carlos," she said casually during a quiet moment, "has there been any change to the quantum computing facility's security protocols for after-hours access?" Carlos shook his head. "Standard biometric verification and badge scan. Why?" "Just updating my mental map. I heard there's a system test tonight. Might affect some of our security feeds." "First I've heard of it," Carlos replied with a shrug. "But you know how it is. They never tell security anything until it's an emergency." Morgan nodded, filing away this information. If Carlos hadn't been notified about the test, that meant it was either very compartmentalized or deliberately kept from regular security personnel. Neither option was reassuring. During her afternoon break, Morgan slipped into an unused office and used a secure terminal to access public research databases. She needed to understand exactly what kind of quantum computing integration might allow someone to manipulate nuclear materials tracking systems. Most of the relevant research was classified, but there were enough hints in academic papers to piece together the possibilities. Quantum computing could theoretically break most conventional encryption methods. If someone gained sufficient quantum computing power and access to the right systems, they could potentially alter digital records without leaving evidence, creating a perfect cover for ongoing theft of nuclear materials. But why would anyone at Oakridge be involved in such a scheme? The facility housed some of the nation's top scientists, all of whom had undergone extensive background checks. Then again, as Morgan knew from her security training, even the most secure facilities were vulnerable to insider threats, particularly when multiple insiders coordinated their efforts. At 6 p.m., Morgan's shift ended. She stopped by the locker room to retrieve the lab coat she kept for emergency radiation response situations, then drove to a diner a few miles from the facility. She needed time to think, and a place where she could watch for any signs of surveillance. Over a cup of coffee that grew cold as she pondered her next steps, Morgan weighed her options. She could report her suspicions directly to the Department of Energy or FBI, bypassing Hargrove entirely. But without hard evidence, she risked being dismissed as paranoid, or worse, interfering with an official investigation if the authorities were already aware of the situation. No, she needed to gather concrete evidence first. And that meant proceeding with the plan to investigate the quantum computing facility tonight. At 8:30 p.m., Morgan parked her car in the employee lot furthest from the security cameras and made her way to the designated meeting point. The January night was bitterly cold, her breath forming small clouds in the air as she waited, badge in hand, lab coat buttoned up against the chill. Eliza appeared precisely at 8:45, her own lab coat crisp and professional beneath her winter coat. "Ready?" she asked without preamble. Morgan nodded. "What's our cover story?" "You're helping me calibrate radiation detection equipment for the test." "It's plausible given your background." Eliza handed her a radiation dosimeter badge. "Put this on. Anyone who questions your presence, Direct them to me. They approached the rear entrance, where a security guard Morgan recognized as Johnson from the night shift was stationed. "Evening, Dr. Chen," Johnson said, nodding to Eliza before his eyes shifted to Morgan. "Reynolds. Didn't expect to see you back tonight." "Special request," Eliza interjected smoothly. "I needed someone with radiation safety training to assist with monitoring during the test. Deputy Chief Reynolds was kind enough to volunteer." Johnson nodded, apparently satisfied. "Badge scans for both of you, please." After clearing security, Eliza led Morgan through a series of corridors toward the quantum computing wing. The facility was eerily quiet compared to its daytime bustle, with only essential personnel present for the night's test. "The integration team is setting up in the main computing lab," Eliza whispered as they walked. Dr. Whitmore and 3 of his researchers, plus Hargrove, who insisted on overseeing the test personally. Morgan's pulse quickened. Hargrove's presence complicated matters significantly. "Where are we headed?" "Radiation monitoring station first. We need to maintain our cover. Then we'll find a way to access the system architecture they're testing." The radiation monitoring station was a small room adjacent to the main quantum computing laboratory, separated by a glass partition that allowed them to observe the activity in the larger space. Through the glass, Morgan could see Dr. Whitmore and his team working intently at computer terminals while Hargrove paced behind them, checking his watch periodically. "They're preparing for a full system test of the quantum classical interface," Eliza explained quietly as she began setting up monitoring equipment. "This is the first time they're connecting the quantum system to the lab's main secure database network, including the nuclear materials tracking database," Morgan asked. Eliza nodded. "That's scheduled for the final phase of tonight's test. They're starting with non-sensitive systems first." For the next 30 minutes, they maintained their cover, with Eliza walking Morgan through standard radiation monitoring procedures while they observed the activity in the main lab. Morgan noted with growing concern that one of Whitmore's researchers, a man named Kumar, whom she recognized from security briefings, was working at a terminal separated from the others, his screen angled away from both his colleagues and the security cameras. "I need to see what Kumar is working on," Morgan whispered. "Can you create a distraction?" Eliza looked uncertain, but nodded. "Give me a minute." She adjusted some settings on the monitoring equipment, then abruptly straightened. "That's not right," she said, loud enough to be heard through the glass partition. She pressed the intercom button. "Dr. Whitmore, I'm getting unusual radiation readings from the quantum processor cooling system. Could you and the team step out for a moment while I verify it's not a monitoring error?" Whitmore looked annoyed at the interruption but nodded. 5-minute break, everyone. Let's clear the room until Dr. Chen gives us the all-clear." As the team filed out, including Hargrove, who followed Whitmore with a concerned expression, Morgan slipped. The screen showed what appeared to be standard database integration code, but as Morgan scrolled through it, her trained eye caught something anomalous, a subtle backdoor being created within the authentication protocols. It wasn't just a security vulnerability. It was a deliberately engineered access point that would allow someone to alter records without triggering alerts. Quickly, Morgan took photos of the code using her phone, then returned to the radiation monitoring room, just as Eliza was assuring Whitmore that it had indeed been a false alarm. "Calibration error," Eliza explained confidently. "The system is perfectly safe. You can resume your test." As the team returned to their workstations, Morgan whispered to Eliza, "I found something. We need to get out of here." Eliza nodded subtly. "Let me finish this monitoring sequence. Then we can go." But before they could make their exit, Hargrove appeared at the door of the monitoring station, his expression unreadable. "Reynolds," a word. Morgan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the building's aggressive air conditioning. "Of course, sir." Hargrove led her into the corridor, out of earshot of the others. "Your presence here is unexpected." Dr. Chen didn't mention she was bringing an assistant, particularly not someone from security. "Radiation safety falls under security protocols, sir," Morgan replied evenly. Dr. Chen needed qualified assistance. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Hargrove's eyes narrowed. And your interest couldn't possibly be related to the security concerns you raised this morning? Concerns I specifically told you were outside your purview? I'm just doing my job, sir. Ensuring proper radiation safety procedures during a sensitive test. For a moment, Hargrove studied her, his gaze calculating. I'll be reviewing the security footage from tonight's test very carefully, Reynolds. If I find you've accessed any systems or areas not directly related to radiation monitoring, there will be consequences. Understood, sir, Morgan replied, maintaining her professional demeanor despite the implied threat. Hargrove turned to leave but paused. Oh, and Reynolds? I received an interesting report today about unauthorized queries run on the materials tracking database yesterday evening. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you? Morgan kept her expression neutral. No, sir. As you pointed out this morning, I don't have access to that database. See that it stays that way. With a final warning look, Hargrove returned to the main lab. Eliza appeared at Morgan's side moments later. What was that about? He suspects something. Morgan whispered. We need to get this information out now. They completed their radiation monitoring duties as quickly as professionally possible, then made their exit from the facility. Once they were in the parking lot, safely away from the building's security cameras, Morgan showed Eliza the photos she'd taken. This is definitely a back door, Eliza confirmed, examining the code. And not just any back door. It's specifically designed to manipulate transaction records in a way that would be virtually undetectable without quantum computing methods to detect it. Perfect for covering up material theft, Morgan said grimly. And look who's implementing it, Kumar. He's been present during every inventory discrepancy Jensen identified. Eliza handed the phone back. This is enough to warrant an official investigation. We need to contact the FBI's WMD directorate immediately. Not from here, Morgan cautioned, glancing around the darkened parking lot. And not using our personal devices. If Hargrove is involved, he could be monitoring communications. My sister lives about 20 minutes from here, Eliza suggested. We can use her landline. As they drove separately to Eliza's sister's house, Morgan kept a careful eye on her rearview mirror, watching for any signs of surveillance. The threatening text message earlier had made it clear that someone was monitoring her activities. Whether that someone was Hargrove or someone else remained to be seen. Eliza's sister, a pediatrician named Maya, welcomed them with bemused concern when they arrived and explained they needed to use her landline for an urgent, secure call. She gave them privacy in her home office, where Morgan dialed the number for the FBI's Weapons of Mass Destruction Directorate. This is Deputy Chief of Security Morgan Reynolds at Oakridge National Laboratory. She said when the call was answered, I need to report evidence of potential nuclear material theft and a sophisticated cover-up operation. This is not a drill. The FBI agent who took her call was professional and thorough, asking detailed questions about the evidence Morgan and Eliza had gathered. After nearly 30 minutes of explanation, the agent informed them that a team would be dispatched immediately to secure the facility and investigate their allegations. Stay where you are, the agent instructed. Do not return to the facility or contact anyone there. Our team will reach out to you directly once they've assessed the situation. After hanging up, Morgan turned to Eliza, the gravity of what they'd just done settling over them. There's no going back now. There never was, Eliza replied solemnly. Not from the moment you discovered the discrepancies. They spent a tense night at Maya's house, taking turns watching for any suspicious activity outside while waiting for word from the FBI. Morgan used the time to organize her thoughts and evidence, preparing a comprehensive briefing for the investigators. At 5:47 a.m., her phone rang. An unknown number. Reynolds, she answered cautiously. This is Special Agent Marcus Torres, FBI WMD Directorate. A deep voice responded. We've secured the quantum computing facility and are conducting a full investigation. We need you and Dr. Chen to come in for a formal statement. What about Hargrove and Kumar? Morgan asked. We're bringing in everyone involved with the project for questioning, Torres replied, his tone revealing nothing. A car will pick you up in 30 minutes. Be ready. When the FBI agents arrived, they escorted Morgan and Eliza to a temporary command center established in a conference room at a nearby federal building. The room was buzzing with activity. agents conferring in hushed tones, technical experts examining equipment, and grim-faced Department of Energy officials reviewing documents. Special Agent Torres, a tall man with a weathered face and watchful eyes, greeted them with a firm handshake. Dr. Chen, Deputy Chief Reynolds, thank you for bringing this to our attention. Your timing was fortuitous. What do you mean? Morgan asked. Torres gestured for them to sit. The system test last night wasn't just an integration test. According to our preliminary investigation, it was the final step before implementing a sophisticated theft mechanism. If successful, it would have allowed the perpetrators to remove significant quantities of weapons-grade material, while the tracking system showed normal inventory levels. Eliza inhaled sharply. So we were right. More than right, Torres confirmed. You may have prevented a major nuclear security breach. We've already recovered approximately 35 grams of U-235 from Kumar's residence, along with plans for transferring additional material to an as-yet unidentified third party. And Hargrove? Morgan asked, though she already suspected the answer. In custody, along with Kumar and 2 other members of the quantum computing team. They appear to be part of a sophisticated proliferation network with international connections. The investigation is ongoing, but the evidence against them is substantial. Relief washed over Morgan, relief tinged with vindication. Her concerns hadn't been paranoia after all. Her instincts, honed by years of scientific training and security experience, had been correct. What happens now? She asked. Now, Torres said. We need your help putting all the pieces together. Your unique combination of nuclear physics knowledge and security expertise makes you particularly valuable to this investigation. For the next several hours, Morgan and Eliza worked with the FBI team, providing detailed information about the facility's systems, the materials involved, and the potential implications of what had been planned. Morgan's comprehensive security assessment, the same one Hargrove had dismissed, proved invaluable in understanding how the conspiracy had exploited vulnerabilities in the laboratory's procedures. As the day progressed, more details emerged. Hargrove had been recruited 3 years ago by a foreign intelligence service, his financial troubles and resentment over career setbacks making him a prime target. He had then helped place Kumar and others in key positions within the laboratory, gradually building a network capable of executing the theft and cover-up. They specifically sought positions that would give them access. Deputy Chief Reynolds, Lawson addressed Morgan directly during a briefing. Your actions exemplify the kind of vigilance we need in our nuclear security personnel. If more security officers had your combination of technical knowledge and moral courage, incidents like this would be much rarer. The praise, coming from someone of Lawson's stature, brought a flush of pride to Morgan's face. After years of being dismissed and underestimated, her expertise was finally being recognized. Thank you, Director, Morgan replied, but I was just doing my job. No, Lawson corrected her firmly. You went well beyond your job description. You identified vulnerabilities that others missed, pursued evidence despite active opposition from your supervisor, and took significant personal risks to protect national security. That's not just doing your job. That's exceptional service. As the day wore on, Morgan found herself increasingly involved in the FBI's investigation, her insights helping to untangle the complex web of deception that Hargrove and his co-conspirators had woven throughout the laboratory's systems. By evening, it became clear that the threat had been even greater than initially suspected. The recovered uranium was just the beginning. The conspirators had been preparing to remove much larger quantities once their quantum computing backdoor was operational. Based on the communications we've recovered, they were planning to divert enough material for multiple radiological dispersal devices. Torres informed Morgan and Eliza during a final briefing. The targets included several major American cities. Your intervention may have saved thousands of lives. The weight of this statement settled over the room. Morgan had known the stakes were high, but hearing it stated so plainly that her actions had potentially prevented mass casualties brought home the full significance of what had happened. As they prepared to leave for the day, Director Lawson approached Morgan once more. Reynolds, I'd like to speak with you privately if you have a moment. They moved to a quiet corner of the command center, away from the bustle of the ongoing investigation. I've reviewed your personnel file, Lawson began without preamble. MIT nuclear physics degree, specialized training in radiological security, excellent performance evaluations from everyone except Hargrove. And yet you've been essentially sidelined in a basic security role. Morgan shrugged slightly. The Los Alamos incident was a mischaracterization of appropriate caution as panic. Lawson finished for her. Yes, I've read the full report. You were right to raise concerns about potential radiation exposure, and the supervisors who dismissed you were wrong. Unfortunately, once these things go into your record, they tend to follow you. I've made my peace with it, Morgan said, though they both knew that wasn't entirely true. Well, I haven't, Lawson replied firmly. The Department of Energy needs people with exactly your combination of scientific knowledge and security mindset, particularly now with this investigation highlighting serious vulnerabilities in our nuclear security infrastructure. Morgan looked at her curiously. What are you suggesting? I'm offering you a position, Lawson said, Special Advisor for Nuclear Security Integration at DOE headquarters. You'd be responsible for reviewing security protocols across all nuclear facilities, with particular attention to cyber-physical vulnerabilities like the one you uncovered here. The offer was so unexpected that Morgan momentarily lost her composure. That would be a significant promotion. It's the position you should have had years ago, if not for that misguided evaluation at Los Alamos, Lawson stated matter-of-factly. Your actions here have more than demonstrated your capabilities. The question is, are you interested? Morgan thought about the security checkpoint where she'd spent the last 5 years, watching others pursue the scientific work she'd once dreamed of doing. She thought about Hargrove's dismissive attitude, and all the times her expertise had been ignored or belittled. But she also thought about what she'd accomplished from that position, how her unique perspective as both scientist and security officer had allowed her to see connections others missed, how she'd used that perspective to prevent what could have been a catastrophic nuclear security breach. Yes, she said with growing conviction. I'm definitely interested. Lawson nodded, satisfied. Good. There will be formal interviews and paperwork, of course, but consider this a preliminary offer. We need you in Washington as soon as this investigation permits. As Morgan left the federal building that evening, walking alongside Eliza toward the waiting FBI vehicles that would take them to their temporary accommodations, she felt a profound shift in her professional identity. For years, she'd seen herself as a failed scientist relegated to security work. Now she understood that her dual expertise wasn't a career detour. It was a unique qualification that had allowed her to see what others couldn't. So, Eliza said with a small smile, Special Advisor Reynolds. Quite a change from just security, isn't it? Morgan returned the smile, thinking of how far she'd come in just 48 hours. I'm not sure I've fully processed it yet. Yesterday I was scanning badges and being told to stay in my lane. Today I'm helping the FBI prevent nuclear terrorism. And tomorrow? Eliza prompted. Morgan looked up at the night sky. Stars barely visible through the light pollution of the city. Tomorrow I start making sure nothing like this ever happens again. The car that would take them to their hotel waited, its engine idling in the cold night air. As Morgan opened the door, she took one last look at the federal building where the investigation into Hargrove's conspiracy continued. She had spent years doubting her path, wondering if her career had been derailed beyond recovery. Now she understood that every step, even the painful ones, had led her exactly where she needed to be. Not just security after all, but something far more important. The right person, with the right knowledge, in the right place, at exactly the right time. 3 weeks after the raid at Oakridge, Morgan sat in a wood-paneled conference room at the Department of Energy headquarters in Washington, D.C. The transition had been swift and dizzying, from security checkpoint officer to key witness in a high-profile nuclear terrorism investigation to her new role as Special Advisor for Nuclear Security Integration. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The table around her was filled with senior officials from the DOE, FBI, National Nuclear Security Administration, and Homeland Security. At the head of the table sat Director Lawson, who had called this emergency meeting to discuss the preliminary findings of the Oakridge investigation. "Let me introduce our newest team member," Lawson began, nodding toward Morgan. "Special Advisor Morgan Reynolds joins us from Oakridge National Laboratory, where her actions were instrumental in uncovering and stopping the proliferation conspiracy. Her unique background in both nuclear physics and security operations gives her a perspective we desperately need." Morgan felt the weight of a dozen evaluating gazes. In her charcoal suit and silk blouse, hastily purchased for her new position, she looked the part of a Washington official, but inside she still felt like the security officer who had been repeatedly told to stay in her lane. "Thank you, Director," Morgan said, keeping her voice steady. "I'm here to ensure that what happened at Oakridge never happens again. And that's precisely why we've called this meeting." Lawson continued, her expression grave. "The Oakridge incident has exposed vulnerabilities that likely exist across our entire nuclear security infrastructure. The combination of traditional material theft with quantum computing capabilities to cover the digital tracks represents a new and concerning threat vector." Special Agent Torres, who had led the FBI investigation, took over the briefing. "We've identified 17 individuals connected to the conspiracy, including former Security Director Victor Hargrove and 3 members of the quantum computing team. International connections have been traced to a sophisticated proliferation network with links to 3 foreign states." Morgan listened intently as Torres outlined the conspiracy's scope. What had begun as her personal suspicion about inventory discrepancies had unraveled into a plot that stretched across continents. "The technical sophistication of this operation was unprecedented," Torres continued. "Without Special Advisor Reynolds' intervention, we believe the conspirators would have successfully implemented their quantum backdoor, allowing them to remove significant quantities of weapons-grade material, while the tracking system showed normal inventory levels." A Homeland Security official leaned forward. "And what was the intended use of this material?" Quote, "Based on recovered communications and the materials found in the conspirators' possession, they were planning to create multiple radiological dispersal devices targeting civilian population centers," Torres replied grimly. "Conservative estimates suggest potential casualties in the thousands, with economic impacts in the billions." A heavy silence fell over the room as the officials absorbed this information. Morgan thought about how close the plot had come to succeeding, how easily her concerns might have been dismissed completely if she hadn't persisted. "This brings us to the purpose of today's meeting," Lawson said. "Special Advisor Reynolds has prepared an initial assessment of vulnerabilities that may exist at other DOE facilities based on what was discovered at Oakridge." "Reynolds?" Morgan took a deep breath and opened the folder before her. This was her moment to ensure that her experience translated into systemic change. "Thank you, Director. My assessment identifies 3 critical vulnerability categories that require immediate attention across all nuclear facilities." She began, her voice growing more confident as she spoke. "First, the integration of quantum computing capabilities with nuclear materials tracking systems creates novel attack vectors that our current security protocols aren't designed to detect." She detailed the technical aspects of the vulnerability, explaining how quantum computing could be used to manipulate database records in ways that conventional security measures would miss. The officials listened attentively, many taking notes. "Second," Morgan continued, "we have a personnel vulnerability. At Oakridge, Hargrove was able to systematically undermine security measures because of his position and the deference given to his authority. He specifically targeted and marginalized employees who raised concerns, creating a culture where questioning was discouraged." Morgan couldn't help thinking of her own experience, the constant dismissal, the belittling comments, the implicit threats to her career. "And third, we have what I call the expertise blind spot. The conspiracy succeeded as long as it did because we've siloed our personnel into narrow specialties. Nuclear scientists focus on research, security officers focus on physical protection, IT specialists focus on cyber threats, but the most dangerous vulnerabilities exist at the intersections between these domains. As Morgan outlined her recommendations for addressing these vulnerabilities, she noticed several officials exchanging impressed glances. Her analysis was comprehensive, drawing on both her scientific training and security experience to identify weaknesses that specialists in either field might have missed. The key to preventing future incidents, she concluded, is integration, not just of systems but of expertise. We need to break down the barriers between scientific security and technical personnel to create a holistic security culture. Director Lawson nodded approvingly. Thank you, Special Advisor Reynolds. This is precisely why your perspective is so valuable. She turned to address the entire group. I'm proposing an immediate security stand-down at all Category I nuclear materials facilities for comprehensive vulnerability assessments based on Reynolds' framework. What followed was an intense discussion of implementation details, budgets, timelines, personnel requirements. Morgan contributed confidently, drawing on her first-hand knowledge of facility operations and security protocols. As the meeting concluded, the Deputy Secretary of Energy, who had been quietly observing throughout, addressed Morgan directly. Reynolds, your analysis is the most comprehensive I've seen in 20 years at the department. If you'd been in a position of authority years ago, we might have identified these vulnerabilities before they were exploited. The comment, while meant as a compliment, carried a sting of truth. Morgan had spent years with her expertise ignored and dismissed, relegated to checking badges while harboring insights that could have strengthened national security. Thank you, sir, she replied. But what matters now is that we're addressing them. After the meeting dispersed, Director Lawson lingered behind with Morgan. That was impressive work. How are you settling into Washington? Still finding my footing, Morgan admitted. Everything's happening so quickly. As she worked, a news alert popped up on her screen. Former Oakridge security director indicted on nuclear terrorism charges. The article detailed the federal indictment against Hargrove and his co-conspirators, noting that the charges carried potential life sentences. Morgan felt no satisfaction at Hargrove's downfall. His betrayal had endangered countless lives and damaged the integrity of the nuclear security system she had dedicated her career to upholding. If anything, she felt a renewed determination to repair that system and strengthen it against future threats. Her phone rang, an unknown Washington number. Reynolds, she answered. Special Advisor Reynolds, this is Secretary Wilson's office. The voice was crisp and professional. The Secretary would like to meet with you tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. to discuss your security assessment initiative. Morgan felt a flutter of nerves. The Secretary of Energy wanting a personal briefing represented both an opportunity and a challenge. I'll be there. Thank you. After ending the call, Morgan returned to her team-building project with increased focus. If she was meeting the Secretary tomorrow, she needed a concrete implementation plan, not just a conceptual framework. She worked late into the night, refining her approach and identifying potential team members from across the nuclear security enterprise. By the time she finally went to bed, she had a comprehensive strategy for transforming how nuclear security was managed across the department's facilities. The next morning, Morgan arrived at DOE headquarters dressed in a new suit she'd purchased the previous weekend, one of several professional outfits she'd needed to acquire for her sudden elevation to the policy world of Washington. The security guards at the entrance, noting her newly issued senior staff badge, treated her with a deference that still felt strange after years of being on the other side of the checkpoint. Director Lawson met her in the lobby. Ready for this? The Secretary doesn't request meetings lightly. As ready as I can be, Morgan replied, straightening her jacket. Just remember, you're here because you saw what no one else did. That perspective is valuable. Don't downplay it. They rode the elevator to the executive floor in silence, Morgan mentally reviewing the key points of her presentation. When they entered the Secretary's spacious office, she was surprised to find not just Secretary Wilson but also the Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security and the FBI Director. Ms. Reynolds. Secretary Wilson greeted her, extending his hand. Thank you for joining us. Your work has caught the attention of the highest levels of government. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, Morgan replied, shaking his hand firmly. I appreciate the opportunity. Please, sit. Wilson gestured to the seating area where the others were already gathered. We've been discussing the implications of the Oakridge incident and your preliminary security assessment. To be blunt, It's raised serious concerns about our nuclear security posture nationwide." The FBI director nodded. "The investigation has revealed vulnerabilities that potentially affect every Category I nuclear facility in the country. The President has directed us to address this as a matter of national security priority." Morgan listened as the officials outlined the government's response strategy, which centered on a comprehensive security review of all nuclear facilities using the framework she had developed. "Which brings us to the purpose of this meeting," Secretary Wilson continued. "We need someone to lead this effort, someone who understands both the technical and security dimensions of the problem. Director Lawson has recommended you for the position." Morgan glanced at Lawson, who gave her an encouraging nod. "We're establishing a nuclear security integration task force with broad authority to review and revise security protocols across all facilities," Wilson explained. "As executive director of this task force, you would report directly to me, with support from both DOE and FBI resources." As Morgan made her way to the small holding room where the dignitaries were gathering, she caught snippets of conversation from the security personnel and scientists mingling in the atrium. Unlike the rigid separation she had observed at Oakridge, here they spoke as colleagues, exchanging insights and perspectives across disciplinary boundaries. Secretary Wilson greeted her with a firm handshake. "Director Reynolds, quite a day for you." "For all of us, Mr. Secretary," Morgan replied modestly. "Don't downplay your role," Wilson. The Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security, who had been part of that initial meeting 2 years ago, nodded in agreement. "The integration model you've developed is being adapted for other critical infrastructure sectors. Your influence extends far beyond nuclear facilities." Morgan accepted the praise graciously, but her mind was already on the challenges ahead. The Nuclear Security Integration Center represented a new approach, but institutional change was never simple or straightforward. Resistance remained in pockets throughout the nuclear enterprise, particularly from those who saw the new emphasis on cross-functional collaboration as a threat to established hierarchies. As they moved toward the atrium for the ceremony, Morgan caught sight of a familiar face in the crowd, Carlos Jimenez, her former colleague from the Oakridge security checkpoint. After the conspiracy was exposed, Carlos had been among the first to volunteer for the enhanced training program Morgan had established for security personnel. "Deputy Chief Jimenez," Morgan greeted him, genuinely pleased. "I'm glad you could make it." Carlos beamed with pride at his new title. "Wouldn't have missed it, Director. You showed us all what security personnel can accomplish when we're taken seriously." Indeed, one of Morgan's key innovations had been establishing career advancement pathways for security officers who demonstrated aptitude for the technical aspects of nuclear protection. Carlos now led the security operations at Oakridge, with direct reporting lines to both site management and Morgan's center. The ceremony began with the usual speeches from government officials, each praising the center's mission and the collaborative approach it represented. When it was Morgan's turn to speak, she stepped to the podium with quiet confidence, a far cry from the hesitant security officer who had once feared raising concerns to her supervisor. 2 years ago, a conspiracy at Oakridge National Laboratory nearly resulted in the theft of nuclear materials for terrorist purposes, she began, her voice clear and strong. That conspiracy succeeded as long as it did because we had created artificial barriers between our scientific and security personnel, barriers that prevented critical information from flowing to those who needed it most. The audience listened attentively as Morgan outlined the changes implemented since then. The integrated teams that combined scientific, technical, and security expertise, the anonymous reporting system that allowed concerns to be raised without fear of retaliation, the cross-training programs that gave security personnel scientific understanding and the center we dedicate today is not just a building, she continued. It's a commitment to a fundamental principle, that protecting our nation's most dangerous materials requires the full spectrum of our collective expertise. Not scientists working in isolation from security concerns, not security personnel denied access to technical understanding, but a true integration of all perspectives. As Morgan concluded her remarks to enthusiastic applause, she reflected on the personal journey that had brought her to this moment. From the crushing disappointment of the Los Alamos incident that had derailed her scientific career, through the years of frustration at Oakridge where her expertise was dismissed, to now leading a presidential initiative that was transforming nuclear security nationwide. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. After the ribbon cutting and the obligatory photos with officials, Morgan finally had a moment to herself in her new office. The space was designed to reflect her integrated approach. Glass walls symbolizing transparency, adjoining doors to both the scientific and security wings of the facility, cutting-edge technology that connected the center to nuclear facilities across the country. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Dr. Nathan Whitmore, former head of the quantum computing project at Oakridge and now chief technical advisor for the center. Unlike Kumar and the other conspirators, Whitmore had been cleared of involvement, though his dismissiveness of security concerns had inadvertently facilitated the plot. "May I come in, Director?" he asked, his demeanor far more respectful than it had been during their Oakridge interactions. "Of course, Nathan," Morgan replied, gesturing to a chair. Whitmore sat, looking slightly uncomfortable. "I wanted to say something that's been on my mind for a while now." "About Oakridge, and how I treated your security concerns." Morgan raised an eyebrow but remained silent, giving him space to continue. "I was wrong," he said simply. "I thought of security as an impediment to research, not as an essential partner. If I had listened to your warnings about the integration vulnerabilities, we might have caught the conspiracy earlier." The admission clearly wasn't easy for him. Whitmore had been a respected scientific leader for decades, accustomed to deference rather than to acknowledging mistakes. "Thank you for saying that," Morgan responded. But the problem wasn't just individual attitudes. It was a system that created artificial divisions between scientific and security personnel. "That's what we're fixing now," Whitmore nodded thoughtfully. "And that's why I wanted to talk to you today. My team has been developing a new quantum encryption protocol for nuclear materials tracking systems. In the old days, we would have designed it in isolation, then thrown it over the wall to security for implementation. But I'd like to take a different approach this time." "What did you have in mind?" Morgan asked, intrigued. "An integrated development team from the beginning. My quantum specialists working alongside your security experts to build in protections from the ground up. No silos, no handoffs, just collaborative development all the way through." Morgan smiled, recognizing this for the significant shift in thinking it represented. "That's exactly the approach the center was created to facilitate. Let's set up a kickoff meeting for next week." After Whitmore left, Morgan turned to the window, looking out at the Washington skyline as evening approached. The city was entering its nightly transition, government workers heading home while security personnel began their night shifts. The same rhythm she had observed 2 years ago when starting the task force, but now viewed from a very different position. Her intercom buzzed. "Director Reynolds, there's an urgent call from Sandia National Laboratory. They're reporting unusual access patterns in their materials tracking system." Morgan felt a familiar surge of alertness. "Put it through to the Integration Center. Assemble the rapid response team." Within minutes, Morgan was in the center's main operations room, surrounded by screens displaying data from Sandia's systems. A team of specialists, scientists, security experts, and IT professionals had already begun analyzing the anomalies. "Pattern recognition shows similarities to the Oakridge intrusion attempt," reported the lead analyst. "Someone's trying to create subtle modifications in the inventory reconciliation algorithms. Not enough to trigger standard alerts, but consistent with preparations for material diversion." "Have they accessed any actual materials yet?" Morgan asked, studying the patterns. "Negative. This appears to be the preliminary phase, creating the digital cover for future theft." Morgan made a quick decision. Implement Protocol 173, full system isolation, and enhanced physical security around all Category Y materials. Then deploy the forensic team to identify the intrusion pathways. The response was immediate and coordinated, with none of the jurisdictional battles or communication delays that would have characterized such an incident before the reforms. Within an hour, the potential breach had been contained, the vulnerability identified, and a suspect, a recently hired systems administrator with falsified credentials, taken into custody. As the situation stabilized, Torres called from FBI headquarters. "Preliminary interrogation suggests our suspect is connected to the same network as the Oakridge conspirators. Different approach, same endgame. But a very different outcome," Morgan noted. 2 years ago, this attempt might have succeeded, or at least progressed much further before detection. The integrated monitoring made the difference. Your integrated monitoring, Torres corrected. This is what happens when we break down those silos you've been fighting against. After the call ended, Morgan gathered the response team for a debriefing. The room held an atmosphere of quiet professionalism mixed with justified pride. The system works when it's designed to incorporate all perspectives. That's what we've built here. Later that evening, as Morgan prepared to finally leave the center after the long and eventful day, her secure phone rang again. This time it was the secretary himself. "I've been briefed on the Sandia incident," he said without preamble. Impressive response. "Thank you, Mr. Secretary. The team performed exceptionally well." "This vindicates your entire approach, Reynolds. The President has been briefed as well, and he's requested a meeting with you next week to discuss expanding the integration model to other critical infrastructure sectors." After ending the call, Morgan sat at her desk for a moment, absorbing the magnitude of what this meant. What had begun as her desperate investigation into discrepancies at Oakridge was now poised to transform security approaches across multiple national security domains. A knock at her door revealed Lawson, who had stayed to observe the incident response. "Burning the midnight oil?" "Just wrapping up," Morgan replied. "It's been quite a day." Lawson entered, closing the door behind her. "I remember the first time we met, you know. After the Oakridge raid, you were so focused on making sure Hargrove and his conspirators were held accountable that you barely seemed to register the career opportunity in front of you." A ripple of recognition passed through the audience. Many remembered those days, and the hierarchical culture that had characterized the lab before the conspiracy was exposed. "Today, I stand before you not to remind you of what went wrong, but to celebrate what has gone right since then," Morgan continued. "This facility has become a model for the integration approach, where security officers receive technical training, scientists understand security implications, and everyone recognizes that protecting our nuclear materials requires all of our collective expertise." She acknowledged Carlos Jimenez, now Oakridge's security director, whose leadership had been instrumental in implementing the new approach. She recognized Jensen from materials tracking, whose willingness to share information despite Hargrove's disapproval had been crucial to uncovering the conspiracy. After the formal presentation, Morgan toured the facility, noting with satisfaction the visible changes in how security and scientific personnel interacted. The rigid separation she had observed during her time there had been replaced by collaborative engagement, with security officers involved in research planning and scientists participating in vulnerability assessments. Her final stop was the security checkpoint, where she had spent so many hours checking badges and watching researchers pass through. A new officer sat at the station, monitoring IDs with the same vigilance Morgan had once maintained. Director Reynolds. The young woman greeted her with evident admiration. "It's an honor to meet you." "The honor is mine," Morgan replied sincerely. "What you do here is the foundation of everything else. Never let anyone tell you that you're just security." The officer straightened with pride. "No one says that anymore. Not since you showed what security personnel can accomplish when we're taken seriously." As Morgan left Oakridge for the last time, driving past the security perimeter toward the airport, where a government jet waited to return her to Washington, she reflected on the true nature of security in the nuclear age. It wasn't just physical barriers or digital safeguards, though those were essential. It wasn't just clearance levels or access controls, though those were necessary. True security, she had learned, lay in the integration of all perspectives, in systems that valued insight regardless of its source, in cultures that encouraged questions rather than suppressing them. It lay in recognizing that the security officer checking badges might have the critical observation that prevents a catastrophe, that the scientist focused on research might identify a vulnerability no one else could see. The Nuclear Security Integration Center embodied these principles, institutionalizing them in ways that would outlast any individual career. But the center itself had begun with a single security officer refusing to stay in her lane. And in recognizing that threat, she had not only prevented a nuclear security breach, but transformed the entire approach to protecting the nation's most dangerous materials. The plane lifted off, carrying Morgan back to Washington and the continuing work of the center. But part of her would always remain at that security checkpoint, watching researchers stream past, noticing patterns that others missed, refusing to be limited by someone else's definition of her role. That was her legacy. Not just the center or the integration model or the presidential initiatives, but the fundamental recognition that security is everyone's responsibility, that expertise comes in many forms, and that sometimes the most important insights come from those who are told to stay in their lane but refuse to do so. In the nuclear age, with its unprecedented dangers and complex vulnerabilities, that recognition might well be the difference between safety and catastrophe. And Morgan Reynolds, once dismissed as just security, had ensured it was now embedded in the nation's approach to its most dangerous materials. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.